What kind of man dares to believe that the world itself is not enough? And what kind of childhood shapes a boy to see destiny not as possibility, but as obligation? Because the story of Alexander the Great does not begin on a battlefield or beneath a crown. It begins in a kingdom balanced uneasily between myth and steel. In the ancient land of Macedon, where kings ruled by force yet dreamed in legends, and where a child was born amid thunder, prophecy, and ambition so immense it would one day fracture the known world. For in 356 BCE, on the same night that the temple of Artemis burned to the ground, one of the wonders of the ancient world consumed by fire, Olympias, princess of Epirus and wife of King Philip II of Macedon, gave birth to a son. And the coincidence was not lost on the ancient mind, because destruction and birth intertwined were read as signs of divine rearrangement. And from the moment Alexander entered the world, he was surrounded not by certainty, but by competing narratives. A father who forged unity through iron discipline and military reform, and a mother who whispered of gods, heroes, and divine blood, telling her son that he was not merely born, but sent, that Zeus himself had marked him. And this dual inheritance, reason and myth, discipline and destiny, would shape Alexander's psychology long before he ever held a sword, because Philip, too, was no ordinary king. He was a ruthless reformer who transformed Macedon from a fractured backwater into a war machine. And he raised his son not as a sheltered heir, but as a future commander, exposing him early to counsels of war, diplomatic manipulation, and the brutal reality that power is taken, not granted. While Olympias offered a different education, one rooted in mystery cults, ancient epics, and the belief that greatness is not chosen, it is revealed, and between these two forces Alexander grew, absorbing contradiction rather than resolving it, learning to respect strategy while craving immortality. And even as a child, his temperament distinguished him. Intense, proud, restless, intolerant of limitation. And when the wild stallion Bucephalus arrived at court, a beast no man could tame, Alexander saw not danger, but misunderstanding. Realizing the horse feared its own shadow, and by turning it toward the sun he mounted what others could not, an act both symbolic and revealing, because it showed a mind that sought mastery not through force alone, but through perception. And Philip, recognizing this spark, is said to have warned his son that Macedon would be too small for him. And this warning was not encouragement, it was prophecy, because Alexander did not inherit patience, he inherited urgency, and as his education deepened under Aristotle, one of history's greatest philosophers, Alexander was taught logic, ethics, science, medicine, poetry, and above all Homer, whose Iliad became his constant companion, Achilles his chosen mirror, planting within him the dangerous belief that a short life filled with glory outweighed a long life of restraint. And this belief would later fuel brilliance and catastrophe alike. And yet beneath the legend forming around him stood a boy watching his father grow more powerful, more distant, and eventually more threatening to his own claim. As Philip's victories expanded and his marriages multiplied, creating rival heirs and courtly tension, And Alexander learned early that blood alone does not secure succession. It must be defended. And when Philip was assassinated under mysterious circumstances, leaving Macedon stunned and exposed, Alexander was not yet 20. And the world around him expected fracture, rebellion, and collapse. But what followed instead was the emergence of a ruler whose speed, decisiveness, and ferocity revealed a man already prepared for command. Because Alexander did not inherit a kingdom, he seized it, and in that moment, standing between a legacy unfinished and a future unimagined, the boy raised on myth and strategy stepped forward as king, carrying within him a vision so vast it would soon demand the submission of empires. And the ancient world, unaware of what had just been unleashed, began to turn toward its most violent and transformative reckoning. That reckoning arrived faster than anyone expected, because the moment Philip fell, and the ancient world inhaled in anticipation of Macedonian collapse, Alexander exhaled action. And in that instant, the difference between inheritance and command became clear. For at barely 20 years of age, he did not wait for loyalty to form. He demanded it, understanding with brutal clarity that hesitation invites challenge, and challenge invites fracture. And so, before the echoes of his father's funeral had faded, Alexander moved through the court with precision, removing rivals, silencing threats, and making visible what many still doubted, that youth did not mean uncertainty. And in Macedon, where kingship was forged through obedience rather than ceremony, this decisiveness mattered more than lineage. Yet securing the throne was only the first pressure, because beyond Macedon lay Greece, restless and watchful, a collection of proud city-states that had never truly accepted submission, and now believed the moment had come to reclaim autonomy. And among them Thebes rose first, misreading Alexander's age as fragility. And in responding to this defiance, Alexander made a choice that would echo through his entire reign, choosing annihilation over negotiation, not out of uncontrolled rage, but calculated terror, marching south with speed that stunned allies and enemies alike, surrounding Thebes, before disbelief could harden into resistance. And when the city fell, it fell completely. Its streets drowned in silence and ruin, temples spared, poets honored, but power broken so thoroughly that no Greek city could pretend again. That Macedon's grip had loosened, and the message was unmistakable. Resistance would not be debated. It would be erased, and Greece understood, submitting not because it believed in Alexander, but because it feared him. And in that fear he bought himself something priceless: time, because with Greece secured, Alexander no longer needed to look behind him. And at last he could turn toward the horizon that had always drawn his imagination eastward, toward Persia, not merely as an empire to defeat, but as a world to inherit. For Persia represented everything Alexander had been raised to surpass: vast wealth, ancient legitimacy, imperial scale, and a history of humiliating Greek cities. And in 330 for BCE, when he crossed the Hellespont, he did so not as a cautious invader, but as a man stepping into myth, casting a spear into Asian soil and claiming it as land won by the gods. An act that revealed how inseparable ritual and ambition had become within him. because Alexander did not believe he was merely expanding territory. He believed he was correcting history. And from the first clash at the Granicus River, this belief translated into action. As he led from the front, exposing himself to lethal danger, not as recklessness, but as demonstration, because Alexander understood that visibility multiplied loyalty, and loyalty multiplied momentum. And though he nearly died beneath Persian blows, the victory shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility, opening Asia Minor city by city, some surrendering without resistance, others falling beneath Macedonian discipline, and with each step forward Alexander's confidence hardened into certainty, and that certainty would soon be tested when he faced Darius III himself at Issus, where numbers meant nothing against speed, terrain, and relentless pursuit, forcing the Persian king to flee and abandon his own family. And Alexander, aware that victory alone was not enough, treated them with public respect, not from mercy alone but calculation, because legitimacy, once displayed, becomes a weapon as powerful as fear. And here the pattern of his rule emerged fully: ferocity in battle, restraint in triumph. Yet beneath this balance burned an impatience that could not tolerate incompletion, because Alexander did not seek parity with Persia. He sought replacement, and as he advanced deeper into the empire, absorbing cities, adopting symbols of authority, and presenting himself not as foreign conqueror, but rightful king, the boundary between Macedonian ruler and Persian monarch began to dissolve subtly at first, controlled, almost invisible. Yet this transformation carried a cost, because as Alexander reshaped the world around him, he was also reshaping himself, moving further from the disciplined prince raised under Philip and closer to something older, grander, and far more dangerous. And though his armies still followed, still believed, the distance between their understanding of victory and his vision of destiny was beginning to widen, and the consequences of that widening had not yet revealed themselves. That widening distance now demanded resolution, because as Alexander pushed further into the Persian world, victory was no longer measured by defeated armies alone, but by the submission of identity, belief, and space. And it was here, along the eastern Mediterranean coast, that his campaign slowed and his psychology sharpened. When the island city of Tyre refused him entry, not because it doubted his strength, but because it denied his legitimacy, insisting that no foreign king could claim ritual authority within its sacred walls. And for Alexander, this was not a tactical inconvenience. It was a direct challenge to the image he was constructing of himself, because Tyr's resistance suggested limits, and limits were something he increasingly could not tolerate. And so, what followed was not merely a siege but a statement, a 7-month ordeal in which Alexander ordered the sea itself to be reshaped, building a causeway stone by stone toward the island, absorbing losses, enduring setbacks, refusing compromise, driven less by strategy than by necessity, because if one city could stand apart, the illusion of inevitability would fracture, and when Tyre finally fell, it fell brutally, its destruction echoing as a warning across the coast. Yet even here, Alexander's pattern held, cruelty followed by control, because once resistance ended, order was imposed swiftly and the march resumed southward into Egypt, a land long weary of Persian rule. And unlike Tyre, Egypt opened itself willingly, greeting Alexander not as invader, but as deliverer. And in this contrast, Alexander found confirmation of a dangerous idea: that resistance justified annihilation, while submission deserved reverence. And it was in Egypt, far from Macedonia and Greece, that Alexander's self-image shifted most profoundly. Because here he was not merely crowned king, he was named pharaoh, embraced by an ancient religious system that saw rulers as divine intermediaries. And when he journeyed into the desert to consult the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, seeking affirmation of his divine lineage, the answer he received, whether misunderstood, manipulated, or deliberately interpreted, reinforced what Olympias had whispered to him since childhood: that he was more than mortal. And this belief, once symbolic, now began to harden into identity. And though Alexander continued to govern with discipline, founding Alexandria as a city of reason and order, a bridge between Greek thought and Egyptian tradition, the balance within him had shifted. Because destiny no longer felt like inspiration, it felt like entitlement. And when he turned back eastward to confront Darius again, the conflict was no longer between rival kings. It was between inevitability and resistance. And at Gaugamela, the world watched as Alexander faced the largest army Persia could muster. And through tactical brilliance, personal courage, and relentless pressure, he shattered it completely, breaking not only Darius' forces, but the psychological spine of the empire, forcing the Persian king into flight once more, this time never to return to power. And with Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis falling in succession, Alexander stood at the center of a conquered world. Yet instead of satisfaction, he felt acceleration, because conquest had not quieted his ambition. It had sharpened it, and as he entered Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian kingship, and later ordered it burned, whether in drunken impulse or symbolic vengeance, the act revealed a fracture within him, because he was now destroying what he had claimed to inherit. And this contradiction marked a turning point, for Alexander was no longer simply replacing Persia. He was redefining himself through it, adopting Persian dress, customs, and court rituals, demanding gestures of submission from Macedonian officers who had followed him as king, not God. And though victories continued, the unity that had carried him across continents began to strain, because the further Alexander moved from the man his army understood, the closer he moved to the figure only he could see. And the empire, though vast and silent beneath him, had begun to reflect not order, but tension. A tension that would soon turn inward, testing whether the conqueror of the world could still command the loyalty of those who had made his conquest possible. That tension, once subtle, now pressed openly against the foundations of Alexander's command, because empire had given him everything except restraint. And as he pushed beyond Persia into the vast and unfamiliar lands of Central Asia, the war transformed from conquest into endurance, from liberation into occupation. And here the world no longer collapsed before him. It resisted slowly, stubbornly, through distance, climate, and constant rebellion. forcing Alexander into a kind of warfare that tested not only his army, but his patience. And it was in these eastern satrapies, among mountains and deserts far removed from the cities of legend, that the divide between Alexander and his Macedonian companions widened into something dangerous. Because the king, who now wore Persian robes and demanded proskynesis, gestures of near-divine submission, seemed increasingly distant from the commander who once shared their risks as an equal, and resentment grew quietly, fed by exhaustion, unfamiliar customs, and the sense that Alexander was no longer expanding their world but abandoning it. And this resentment erupted most tragically in moments of intimacy rather than battle, when, during a banquet clouded by alcohol and pride, Alexander killed Cletus, the man who had once saved his life at the Granicus, in a fit of rage sparked by criticism and wounded ego. And in the aftermath, as Cletus lay dead by his own hand, Alexander was forced to confront a truth he had long avoided, that his power was no longer tempered by proximity, that those who once spoke freely now feared him, and though he was overcome with remorse, isolating himself in grief, the damage could not be undone, because the act revealed how thin the line had become between authority and tyranny. And yet even this moment did not halt his advance, because Alexander no longer knew how to stop. And so he pressed onward, marrying Roxana, a noble woman of Bactria, not merely as a political gesture, but as a personal attempt to bind himself to the lands he ruled, signaling a vision of fusion rather than domination. A blending of cultures that might survive beyond conquest. But even this vision was imposed at a pace the world could not match, and as Alexander reorganized his empire, recruiting Persians into his army, training them in Macedonian methods, elevating local elites into positions of power, his original companions felt increasingly displaced, sensing that the very empire they had built was evolving into something that no longer belonged to them. And when Alexander announced his intention to push further east into India, beyond the edges of the known world, the strain reached its limit. Because this was no longer about defeating enemies, it was about chasing an idea, the belief that conquest itself was purpose. And at the Hyphasis River, faced with monsoon rains, war-hardened elephants, and years of unending campaign behind them, the Macedonian soldiers finally refused to go further. And in this moment, Alexander faced a challenge he could not crush, intimidate, or outmaneuver, because the loyalty of his army, once absolute, now demanded recognition, and for the first time in his career, Alexander was forced to yield, turning back not because he lacked power, but because power without followers is illusion, and this retreat marked a profound shift, because though the empire remained vast, something essential had been broken. The belief that Alexander's will alone could reshape the world. And as the army began its brutal return through deserts and hardship, the cost of ambition was written in suffering rather than glory. And Alexander, still young yet visibly changed, carried forward not triumph but momentum, moving westward with an empire that now needed governance more than conquest. Even as the weight of everything he had become pressed inward, demanding resolution that victory alone could no longer provide. That demand for resolution followed Alexander back toward the heart of his empire, because conquest had outrun consolidation, and the vast dominion he now ruled required structure, loyalty, and endurance rather than constant motion. Yet still, Alexander struggled to shift from conqueror to governor, for movement had become his nature, and stillness felt like surrender. And as he returned through Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana, he set about reshaping his empire in earnest, enforcing his vision of unity through fusion, ordering mass marriages between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, including his own union with Statera, daughter of Darius, alongside Roxana, believing that blood, culture, and allegiance could be blended into permanence. Yet to many of his companions this felt less like unity and more like erasure, as traditions that had defined their identity were absorbed into something broader and less familiar, and the resentment that had once whispered now spoke openly, culminating in the execution of Philotas and the later death of his father Parmenion, men who had been pillars of Alexander's rise, removed not solely for proven guilt, but because trust had become fragile under absolute power. And these acts marked a final transformation, because Alexander now ruled not through shared hardship, but through distance. And even as he planned further campaigns into Arabia, driven by the same restless horizon that had always pulled him forward, his body began to betray him, worn down by years of wounds, exhaustion, fever, and excess. And in Babylon, the city that symbolized his greatest triumph and his most ambitious vision of empire, Alexander fell ill. The cause uncertain, debated across centuries, whether fever, poisoning, or the slow collapse of a body pushed beyond its limits. And as days passed and his condition worsened, the empire waited, suspended in uncertainty, because Alexander had built a world that depended upon him, but had never prepared it to exist without him. And when his generals asked to whom the empire should be left, his answer, whether deliberate or misremembered, offered no clarity, only consequence. And when Alexander finally died in 323 BCE, not yet 33 years old, the silence that followed was not peace, but fracture, because with his death the illusion of unity collapsed, and the empire he had forged through speed, brilliance, and will was divided among his successors, not as a continuation of his vision, but as a struggle for possession. And yet even as the empire splintered, Alexander's legacy endured in a different form, in cities that bore his name, in cultures reshaped by Hellenic language and ideas, in the memory of a man who had expanded the boundaries of the known world and the limits of ambition itself. And in the final measure, Alexander the Great did not conquer the world so much as he revealed it, showing how far power could reach when driven by belief, how fragile unity becomes when built upon one will, and how time, indifferent to glory, ultimately claims even those who dare to see themselves as more than human, leaving behind not permanence, but echo. And yet that echo did not fade with Alexander's last breath, because history did not close the account of his life at Babylon. It merely changed the way his presence was felt, transforming him from a living force into an enduring standard, against which power itself would be measured. And in the years that followed his death, as his generals carved the empire into rival kingdoms through bloodshed and betrayal, each claiming legitimacy by proximity to his name. It became clear that Alexander had not built a system. He had built a moment, a singular convergence of will, speed, and belief that could not be replicated once the man at its center was gone. And this absence revealed the final paradox of his greatness, that the same intensity which allowed him to reshape the world also made continuity impossible. Because Alexander had ruled through personal presence rather than institutions, through momentum rather than stability, and without him the empire could only fragment. Yet even as political unity collapsed, cultural transformation deepened, because Greek language, art, philosophy, and methods of governance spread across lands that had never known them before, blending with local traditions to create a Hellenistic world that outlived every successor kingdom. And cities founded in Alexander's name became centers of learning, trade, and exchange, carrying his influence far beyond the reach of his armies. And rulers who came centuries later, from Roman emperors to Islamic conquerors, studied his campaigns not merely for tactics, but for insight into ambition itself, seeing in Alexander both a model and a warning, a man who proved that the limits of the known world were not fixed, but also that the limits of the human body, mind, and loyalty could not be ignored, and legends grew around him, some portraying him as a god, others as a tragic hero consumed by his own vision. Because Alexander's life invited interpretation rather than conclusion. And perhaps that is why he endured, not because he ruled longest or governed best, but because he embodied the question that power always asks: how far is too far? And in tracing his rise from a restless Macedonian prince to the master of an empire, stretching across continents, history confronts an uncomfortable truth, that greatness often emerges not from balance, but from imbalance pushed to its extreme. And in the end, Alexander the Great stands not as an answer, but as a mirror reflecting humanity's eternal struggle between ambition and restraint, glory and consequence, and reminding every age that while the world can be conquered in a lifetime, time itself remains unconquerable, and it is there, in that final resistance, that even the greatest are brought to silence, leaving behind not dominion, but memory. That memory, carried forward by scholars, soldiers, poets, and rulers, continued to shape how power was imagined long after the dust of Alexander's campaigns had settled. Because his story did not remain confined to chronicles, it entered the bloodstream of civilization itself, becoming a reference point for ambition in every era that followed. And as centuries passed, men who would never see Macedon or Babylon still measured themselves against a king who had died young but lived expansively, studying his marches, imitating his imagery, invoking his name to legitimize their own authority, from Roman generals who traced their victories back to his tactics, to emperors who sought divine favor through association with his legend. And yet in all these imitations, something essential was missing. Because what they copied were the movements, not the moment, the strategies, not the circumstances, the legend, not the cost. And this distance between myth and reality reveals the final truth of Alexander's life. that his greatness was inseparable from the world that produced him, a world fractured enough to be conquered, vast enough to invite obsession, and young enough in its connections to be unified by force, and Alexander himself, shaped by a father who taught him discipline and a mother who taught him destiny, became the perfect vessel for that moment, not because he was flawless, but because his flaws aligned with opportunity, his impatience with scale, his confidence with uncertainty, his hunger with an open horizon, and when that horizon finally closed, when the world could no longer expand fast enough to satisfy the vision he carried, the strain turned inward, breaking relationships, eroding trust, and leaving an empire that depended too much on one will to survive intact. And yet, even in this, failure lies his enduring relevance, because Alexander demonstrates that history is not shaped by balance alone, but by those rare figures willing to risk everything on an idea, large enough to terrify their own age. And in remembering him, we are not asked to admire blindly or condemn easily, but to understand, to see how brilliance and excess can coexist within the same life, how conquest can liberate and destroy simultaneously, and how legacy is rarely the thing a ruler intends to leave behind. And so Alexander the Great remains suspended between hero and warning, not as a lesson neatly concluded, but as a force that continues to provoke reflection, reminding us that the desire to go further, faster, and beyond what exists is both the engine of human progress and the seed of its greatest losses, and that in the long arc of time, even the most extraordinary lives are ultimately measured not by the lands they held, but by the questions they leave behind, and those questions, unresolved and persistent, are what keep Alexander alive in the imagination long after his armies vanished. Because his story refuses to settle into certainty. Instead, it lingers at the edge of interpretation, inviting each generation to decide whether he should be remembered as a visionary who expanded the human horizon or as a conqueror who confused motion with meaning. And this ambiguity is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of a life lived at relentless speed, where reflection was always postponed until tomorrow, and tomorrow rarely arrived. And when historians look back across the fragments of his reign, they see not a single Alexander, but many. The disciplined student of Aristotle who carried Homer into battle, the ruthless king who destroyed Thebes to secure peace, the charismatic commander who inspired loyalty through shared danger, the distant ruler who demanded reverence once earned through quality, the idealist who dreamed of unity through cultural fusion, and the man increasingly isolated by the very scale of his own success. And it is in this accumulation of contradictions that Alexander becomes most human, because he did not resolve the tension between ambition and restraint. He embodied it, pushing forward until the world itself could no longer keep pace. And even his death reflects this unresolved momentum, sudden, unexplained, leaving behind plans unfulfilled and a future unstructured, forcing others to impose order where he had thrived on motion. And yet, despite the collapse of political unity, the transformation he unleashed proved irreversible, because the Hellenistic world that emerged in the aftermath of his campaigns connected East and West in ways that would shape trade, knowledge, warfare, and philosophy for centuries, creating pathways through which ideas traveled more freely than armies ever could. And in this sense, Alexander achieved what conquest alone never could. He altered the pattern of civilization itself, not through stability, but through disruption. And perhaps this is why his legacy endures with such intensity, because it confronts us with a difficult truth that progress often arrives through imbalance, that expansion carries both creation and loss, and that the individuals who change the course of history are rarely those best suited to live within the world they create. And so Alexander the Great stands as both catalyst and caution, a figure whose life compels admiration and unease in equal measure, reminding us that to push beyond the known is to accept uncertainty, and that even the greatest conqueror cannot conquer consequence. For in the end, the world remembers not only how far he went, but what it cost to go there. That cost, traced across continents and centuries, becomes clearer when Alexander's life is examined not as a sequence of victories, but as a progression of internal shifts. Because the further he traveled from Macedonia, the more his identity fractured into roles he struggled to reconcile: king, general, lawgiver, symbol, and finally myth. And each role demanded something different from the man beneath the crown, creating pressures no single individual could sustain indefinitely. And while his soldiers measured success in rest, reward, and return, Alexander measured it in horizons yet unseen, driven by a belief that stopping was a kind of failure. And this divergence in purpose explains why, even before his death, the empire had begun to feel heavy rather than triumphant, because conquest without closure exhausts those who carry it. And Alexander never allowed himself or his army the luxury of completion. And yet this same refusal to stop is what made him exceptional, because he expanded the limits of what a single lifetime could contain, compressing generations of expansion into a decade of relentless motion. And in doing so, he revealed both the possibilities and the dangers of absolute momentum, showing how vision can unify disparate peoples temporarily while simultaneously eroding the bonds closest to the visionary himself. And it is here, in this tension between scale and intimacy, that Alexander's tragedy takes shape, because the greater his world became, the smaller his circle of trust grew, until authority replaced friendship and command replaced companionship, leaving him increasingly alone at the center of everything he had built. And when historians debate whether Alexander was a hero, a tyrant, or something in between, they often miss this quieter truth: that he was a man outrunning the consequences of his own brilliance. And though death stopped his body, it did not stop the motion he had set in place. Because the wars of his successors, the spread of Hellenistic culture, and the enduring fascination with his name are all extensions of the same force he unleashed. A force that does not settle easily into peace. And in this way, Alexander's life becomes less a story with an ending and more a ripple that continues to move outward, shaping how power is pursued, how ambition is justified, and how greatness is imagined. And as long as humanity continues to admire those who go further than others dare, Alexander the Great will remain present, not as a model to be copied, but as a reminder of what happens when the desire to transcend limits becomes the defining purpose of a life, leaving behind a legacy vast enough to inspire the world and complex enough to trouble it forever. And it is within that trouble, rather than within triumph alone, that Alexander's place in history ultimately settles. Because when the noise of battle fades and the borders of empire dissolve, what remains is not territory but tension, the unresolved weight of a life lived faster than reflection could follow. And this is why Alexander continues to matter, not because he ruled longest or governed most wisely, but because he exposed the extremes of human potential. When ambition is given room to run unchecked, and as late as civilizations looked back upon him, they did so selectively, praising the conqueror while softening the cost, celebrating the visionary while overlooking the exhaustion. Yet the ancient sources themselves, written by those closer to the shock of his passing, reveal a more fragile image. A ruler increasingly haunted by loss, suspicious of dissent, and aware, perhaps too late, that the empire he commanded could not be held together by will alone. And in Babylon, where his body failed but his mind reportedly continued to plan new campaigns, Arabia, the Western Mediterranean, even the edges of the known ocean, Alexander embodied the final contradiction of his life. A man who had everything except the ability to stop, and when he died without naming, a clear successor, whether through silence, ambiguity, or indifference, he left behind not merely an empire divided, but a warning etched into history itself. That power without succession is instability, and greatness without continuity is fragile. And yet even in this failure, Alexander achieved something rare, because he forced the world to think larger than it had before, to imagine connections across cultures, distances, and ideas that once seemed unbridgeable. And though others would later rule more carefully, administer more effectively, and last longer, none would ever again compress so much change into so little time. And this compression is what gives Alexander his enduring intensity, because his life feels less like a reign and more like an eruption, sudden, transformative, and impossible to contain. And as history continues to revisit his story, stripping away myth while preserving meaning, Alexander the Great remains a figure who resists simple judgment, standing at the intersection of brilliance and excess, inspiration and caution, reminding every generation that the drive to exceed limits can reshape the world. But it can also leave behind a silence where certainty once stood, and in that silence, history listens, not for answers, but for understanding. That search for understanding is what ultimately draws us back to Alexander again and again, because his life does not offer closure, it offers exposure, revealing what happens when a single individual becomes the axis around which history turns. And when we step back from the battles and the crowns, what emerges most clearly is not the image of an invincible conqueror, but of a man locked in constant negotiation with himself, forever trying to reconcile who he was with who he believed he was meant to become. And this inner conflict, more than any external enemy, shaped the final meaning of his reign, because Alexander's greatness was never accidental. It was constructed through discipline, education, and relentless self-belief. Yet the same qualities that fueled his ascent also narrowed his capacity for rest, doubt, and compromise, leaving him trapped in a role that demanded perpetual expansion. And this is why even his moments of vision, cultural fusion, shared rule, universal kingship, carried within them an element of compulsion, because they were imposed faster than societies could adapt. And when resistance appeared, whether from cities, cultures, or his own companions, Alexander responded not with patience, but with escalation, driven by the fear that stopping would unravel everything he had built. And in this way, his empire mirrors his psychology, vast, interconnected, brilliant, yet stretched beyond sustainable limits, dependent on constant motion to remain intact. And when motion finally ceased, the structure collapsed inward, not because it lacked value, but because it lacked balance. And yet history does not reduce Alexander to failure, because failure alone cannot explain his endurance, his continued presence in memory, art, literature, and ambition across millennia. And perhaps this is because Alexander represents something essential and uncomfortable about human nature, the desire not merely to succeed within the world, but to redefine the world itself, to test how far identity, power, and belief can be pushed before they fracture. And in watching Alexander push beyond every known boundary, geography, culture, mortality, we are confronted with a question that has no easy answer. Whether greatness is measured by harmony or by reach, by what endures or by what transforms. And Alexander the Great, frozen in youth, crowned in victory, undone by excess, stands forever at that threshold, reminding us that history is not shaped only by those who build carefully, but also by those who dare so completely that even their failure changes what comes after. And standing at that threshold, where daring becomes success and vision slips into obsession, Alexander's story begins to feel less like the tale of a conqueror and more like a meditation on limits. Because everything he touched expanded except his own capacity to endure. And in this contrast lies the final layer of his humanity, often obscured by armor and legend, yet unmistakable when traced carefully through the fragments of his life. For Alexander was never content to be remembered as one among many kings. He wanted to exist outside category, beyond comparison, and this desire shaped not only how he fought, but how he wished to be seen, encouraging myths of divine birth, accepting honors that blurred the line between man and God, and surrounding himself with symbols meant to suggest inevitability rather than mortality. Yet the more he elevated himself above others, the more isolated he became, because divinity demands distance, and distance erodes the shared trust upon which leadership depends. And this isolation is visible in the later years of his reign, when companionship gave way to suspicion, when councils became monologues, and when dissent, once debated, was silenced, not always out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion, because Alexander no longer had the patience to explain himself to a world he believed he was carrying forward. And even as he spoke of unity, of blending cultures and creating a world without borders, his method remained uncompromising, driven by the belief that history could not wait for consent. And this contradiction, universal vision enforced by personal will, defines the tension at the heart of his legacy, because while the world he created allowed ideas, trade, and knowledge to flow in unprecedented ways, it also demonstrated how fragile such systems become when anchored to a single personality. And when Alexander died, the absence of that personality was not filled by institutions or shared principles, but by conflict, as his successors fought not only for territory, but for the right to define what Alexander had meant. And in this struggle, the man himself began to dissolve into symbol, each faction shaping his memory to suit its needs, some emphasizing the disciplined king, others the divine hero, others the reckless youth, and yet none could fully contain him, because Alexander had lived too many lives within one lifetime to be reduced to a single interpretation. And perhaps this is why his story continues to compel, because it resists simplification, refusing to resolve into praise or condemnation, instead offering a portrait of ambition pushed to its furthest edge, where creation and destruction coexist, and where the question is no longer how much one can conquer, but how much one can become without losing oneself entirely, a question Alexander never answered, but one he left behind for history to wrestle with long after his empire fell into dust. And it is in that unresolved struggle between becoming and losing oneself that Alexander's life finally settles into its most enduring form. Not as a completed narrative, but as a tension preserved across time. Because unlike rulers whose achievements can be measured in laws, institutions, or stable dynasties, Alexander left behind something more volatile, an idea of greatness defined by motion, intensity, and personal will. And this idea proved both contagious and dangerous, inspiring generations of leaders to emulate his reach while rarely confronting his limits. And as his successors fought over fragments of his empire, each claiming to be the true heir of his vision, the world began to understand that Alexander's greatest creation was not territorial unity, but cultural acceleration. A sudden compression of civilizations that forced East and West into sustained contact, exchange, and friction, reshaping language, art, warfare, and philosophy in ways that no single empire could later reverse. And yet even this achievement carries the mark of his character, because it emerged not from patient design, but from relentless advance, driven by a man unwilling to accept that the horizon could ever be final. And in this sense, Alexander stands apart from both builders and destroyers, because he was neither content to preserve, nor satisfied to merely conquer. He sought transformation itself, regardless of cost, and that cost, paid in lives, exhaustion, and fragmentation, cannot be separated from the brilliance that made such transformation possible. And when historians attempt to judge him, they often fall into extremes, elevating him as the greatest military mind of antiquity or condemning him as an agent of chaos. Yet both views miss the deeper truth that Alexander was a product of convergence, born at a moment when the world was just connected enough to be unified by force, yet not stable enough to survive unity without him. And this convergence magnified every aspect of his personality, his courage, his imagination, his impatience, his pride, until the man and the moment became inseparable. And this inseparability is what grants his story its tragic dimension. Because Alexander could not outlive the conditions that made him possible. And once those conditions passed, so did the coherence of his world, leaving behind echoes rather than continuity. And yet in those echoes we find the reason he still matters. Because Alexander compels us to confront the uncomfortable reality that history is often changed not by balance or restraint, but by those willing to risk collapse in pursuit of expansion. And in remembering him, we are reminded that greatness is rarely safe, rarely stable, and rarely kind, but it is always revealing, exposing the outer limits of human ambition and the fragile structures that must somehow contain it. And so, as the echoes of Alexander's life stretch ever further from the man himself, what remains is not a map of conquered lands, but a landscape of influence, one that reaches into the foundations of later empires, philosophies, and identities. Because Alexander did not simply alter borders, he altered expectations, teaching the ancient world to imagine power on a scale previously unthinkable. And this shift endured even after his name ceased to command armies, shaping how Rome conceived dominion, how Hellenistic kingdoms governed diversity, and how later rulers justified ambition through destiny rather than tradition. And yet this inheritance was uneven, because while many sought to emulate his reach, few were willing or able to confront the instability that accompanied it, preferring the image of the conquering hero to the reality of the exhausted ruler. And in this selective memory, Alexander became larger than life, preserved in sculpture, epic, and legend as a figure of eternal youth and forward motion, stripped of doubt and consequence, while the quieter truths of his life, his isolation, his losses, his unfulfilled plans, faded into the background. And this transformation from man to myth reveals as much about those who remembered him as about Alexander himself, because every age reshapes the past to serve its own needs, turning complex lives into symbols that justify present desires. And Alexander proved uniquely adaptable to this process, because his story contained multitudes, conqueror and unifier, liberator and destroyer, student and self-declared divine, allowing each generation to extract what it sought. And yet beneath these shifting interpretations, the core tension of his life remains intact. The refusal to accept limits, the belief that identity could be expanded as endlessly as territory. And it is this belief, more than any single battle or policy, that defines his place in history, because it speaks to a universal impulse, the desire to go further than those who came before, to test whether the boundaries of the world are real or merely inherited assumptions. And Alexander tested those boundaries until they gave way, only to discover that beyond them lay not resolution, but responsibility. A responsibility he never fully had the time, or perhaps the temperament, to fulfill. And in recognizing this, we begin to see Alexander not as a figure to be imitated, but as a phenomenon to be understood. A reminder that expansion without consolidation, vision without patience, and power without succession may achieve brilliance, but they cannot achieve permanence. And in this understanding, his legacy finds its final balance, not in admiration or condemnation alone, but in insight, offering history not a hero to worship, but a lens through which to examine the costs and consequences of boundless ambition.
And in the end, when all conquests are measured not by distance traveled, but by what remains when motion stops, Alexander the Great stands revealed not as a ruler who mastered time, but as one who collided with it because his life, compressed into little more than 3 decades, burned too brightly to cool into permanence, leaving behind not a finished world, but a transformed one. And this distinction matters. For Alexander did not create stability, he created possibility, opening pathways between civilizations that would never again fully close, even as the empire he forged dissolved almost immediately under the weight of its own scale. And yet, it is precisely this impermanence that gives his story its enduring force. Because Alexander reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who build carefully for the future, but also by those who dare so completely that they tear open the present, exposing new horizons for others to inhabit. And when we strip away the armor, the titles, and the legend, what remains is a human truth both sobering and profound. That ambition without limit can achieve the extraordinary, but it cannot escape consequence, that greatness pursued at speed may outrun wisdom, and that even the most extraordinary will, untempered by restraint, must eventually yield to forces it cannot command. And so Alexander's legacy does not lie solely in cities named after him, or in the spread of Greek culture across continents, but in the question his life continues to ask every age that studies it: how far should one go, and at what cost? Because Alexander reached the edge of the known world and found not an ending, but silence, a silence filled by successors, myths, and interpretations, each attempting to complete a story that was never meant to be complete. And perhaps this is why Alexander endures, not as an answer, but as a challenge, standing forever at the boundary between ambition and restraint, glory and loss, possibility and limit, reminding us that while the world can be conquered in a lifetime, meaning cannot, and time, indifferent and patient, ultimately claims all things, leaving behind not dominion, but memory. And it is within that memory, fragile yet persistent, that Alexander the Great still lives, not as a king who owned the world, but as a man who dared to believe it could be taken, and in doing so revealed both the power and the peril of that belief for all who came after.